Cybersecurity attacks have grown increasingly sophisticated and brazen over the past couple of years. That's especially true for federal agencies, including the National Institutes of Health, which invests more than $40 billion annually to fund critical medical research. But as NIH adapted to accommodate a huge surge in the number of researchers, employees, and partner institutions working remotely during the pandemic, it became even more critical to strengthen NIH's identity, access, and authentication management practices. One of the ways that NIH is trying to keep up with that challenge is through its alliance with the InCommon Federation, a consortium of more than 5,000 US research and education organizations, which share the work of providing trusted access to academic and research collaborations. Here to explain how that works and why NIH's approach to identity and access management is seen as something of a model that other federal agencies might look into are Jeff Erickson, Information Technology Manager at NIH, and Chris Goodwin, Principal at Deloitte & Touche, LLP. Jeff and Chris, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Good morning, Wyatt. It's good to see you again.
So, Jeff, let me start with you. When it comes to identity and access management, walk us through a little bit of what were some of the key challenges NIH is and was facing during the pandemic.
So, as you said, Wyatt, NIH is the largest public funder of biomedical research in the world, investing its funds to enhance life and reduce illness and disability. And biomedical researchers need access to research data in order to advance discovery and knowledge. Some of these data are available for general use, while other data have restrictions for access. And taken together, the number of researchers who are authorized for access, the variety of data repositories they're trying to connect to, and the disparate access requirements across platforms results in significant complexity for identity and access management. These challenges range from knowing with varying degrees of certainty who the person is who's trying to connect, validating that identity through various means of authentication, and then evaluating what access to allow to which data set, all in a matter of seconds.
Those certainly large in scale and complex in execution. Talk to me a little more about, so what are some of the approaches that NIH is taking to try to address those challenges?
So, as we know from our personal lives, it's very common in our daily lives that we are asked to create an account on a website. And oftentimes that involves creating a password, and as often as not, struggling to keep that password different from the password that we used on the last account, and meeting the complexity requirements for the passwords that seem to vary with each account we create. And then we're also familiar that if we're logging into our online bank, we sometimes appreciate that they might have some additional access requirements, sometimes that one-time passcode that they text to our phone for us to put in, or a one-time code that might be on an app on our phone that we have to type in. So even those private sector sites have a challenge of managing that access for them, what are millions and millions of people trying to access those services. And one of the ways that they and NIH choose to mitigate those challenges of the creating and managing millions of accounts is something called federation. And that really means a trust fabric where I will allow somebody to access my site with a password that they've created elsewhere. And that's really where the Internet 2 and InCommon Federation help us, because we, as a member of InCommon, and there are among the other federal agencies that are also members, that federation allows members from the different organizations to access each other's sites using their home institution's credentials. So if you think of it in your private life, you may sometimes see When you go to log into a site, I've seen it when I use the IMDb app on my phone, that it'll prompt with a list of credentials that I can use to log into that IMDb site. Similarly, when you come, that is a private sector or private usage example of federation. In our space, we might here at NIH want somebody from one of our research institutions, say one of the universities up in Cambridge, or some researcher from one of the universities in the state of California, to use their home institution credential to log into us. Saves us time and money because we don't have to manage the passwords or set up something to help that person when they forgot the password that they created here. It helps them because they're using the credential that they use every day to log into their university email. So that is one of the ways that we're addressing this, is through this federated approach, reliant heavily on InCommon. And I should add that InCommon is really a bridge to other federations like it around the world, that it's not just researchers based here in the US that are able to leverage those capabilities and access our resources. We're able to extend that federated access globally.
Well, Chris Goodwin, I know Deloitte works with a variety of public sector and government organizations. What are you seeing at NIH that stands out in your mind, and perhaps what other agencies might want to pay closer attention to?
Thanks, Wyatt. Well, Jeff touched on a lot of really good things that NIH and frankly, all of HHS are doing today. And when it comes to enterprise, what we call identity credentialing and access management, or known as ICAM, NIH and HHS have really been leaders in the federal government for at least the past decade. I think one of the things that makes NIH stand out is the priority that they've placed on implementing enterprise level business processes that allow them to securely and efficiently create these digital identities, and then tie those to the strong multi-factor authentication that Jeff talked about. Those capabilities go across the enterprise. This has really allowed NIH to implement a strategy to remove all username and passwords for protected resources, which is something that they've been working on for the past few years now and been very successful with it. They've also done a great job of using federation, as Jeff spoke to, as a way to not only increase overall cybersecurity, which is obviously important, but also to create efficiencies and ease of access to a wide array of systems and applications, both on-prem and in the cloud, for their 30 to 40,000 users, not to mention all of their partners. And we know that these people are researchers, are scientists and doctors who rely on quick, dependable access to these protected resources in order to do the incredibly important work that they do every day. So, very important mission. They've done a lot of really good things and been very successful at it so far. Real quick, White, secondly, I think, you talked about what maybe other agencies might want to pay, or organizations might want to pay attention to. We saw this before the pandemic, but now we're seeing it more than ever. You're seeing people wanting to work remotely outside of their government office. More and more, they're no longer can be, afford to be, no longer do they want to be tied or tethered to their office desk and government furnished equipment desktops. Through the implementation of solutions like derived credentials, which Jeff touched on, which is essentially taking the concept of the trusted digital identity and strong multi-factor authentication to mobile devices like phones, laptops, and tablets, along with things like VPN. This basically allows people to securely access protected networks and applications from almost anywhere. So, some of the benefits of doing things like this include greater security, as we talked about, but it also is, we're seeing it's improving employee satisfaction. It's resulting in lower attrition, and this is obviously very important for any organization to think about.
And I'm aware that Deloitte plays a role in something called managed services. So I'm interested if you would explain. So as you work with NIH and others, why are managed services, particularly when it comes to modernizing identity and authentication services, why is that becoming a smarter choice for agencies and their cybersecurity departments?
Yeah, unfortunately, why, as we talked about, as you mentioned, we are seeing an increase in not just the volume of attacks, but the sophistication of attacks. They're growing exponentially across the globe. The reality is that a cyber attack on your organization is more a matter of when and not if. And so it really comes down to how well you're prepared and how well you're able to respond when that attack occurs. The sophistication of the attacks, which now leverage artificial intelligence, machine learning, eventually we'll see the spread of even more advanced capabilities like quantum computing, or something akin to that, which ultimately will make it even harder to protect your attack surface. So this increasing sophistication is likely to make it even harder in the future than it is today for organizations to attract and retain in-house talent that can, operate the increasingly sophisticated cyber solutions and tools that we're all, buying and implementing to fend off these attacks. So, I'd like everyone to consider that identity and access management, this is my opinion, is really the cornerstone of cybersecurity. And you just don't have cybersecurity without strong identity and access management. And obviously each organization is unique and needs to look carefully at its own risk profile. But in general, outside of a small number of organizations, cyber is just not the mission for most organizations. Moving to a managed service can allow an organization to leverage the latest and greatest best of breed cyber tools and intelligence, along with world-class cyber talent who are trained, certified in specific disciplines of cyber. They can help prevent, detect, and respond to attacks on your systems. And in most cases, a managed service can bring lower overall total cost of ownership to an organization. The last thing I'll say why it is, leveraging best of breed tools and solutions can help improve an organization's security posture, but they can also, as I mentioned before, improve the overall user experience. Seems counterintuitive, when you're increasing security, a lot of people feel it gets harder and harder for them to access, the applications and the things they need to do their jobs. But these solutions are not just protecting your system's data, research, et cetera. They're increasing the efficiency in which you're able to get to these things. Single sign-on, which I think Jeff mentioned earlier, is a form of digital identity federation we talked about earlier, and it's an example of how these can bring improved user experiences.
Great points. Lastly, in the time we have left, and I'll put this question to both of you, Jeff and Chris, what's one piece of advice or lesson learned that each of you would offer to other agencies about federated identity and the state of multi-factor authentication management today? Jeff, maybe I'll ask you to field that one first.
Sure. So as Chris and I and our peers in the space of identity and access management know all too well, we can't do this alone. We rely on the kindness of strangers and really that fabric of trust that I mentioned before. And so truly, this is not news to the people in my world, it's not only about federated identity and the multi-factor authentication that goes with it, but along with that is a not completely new concept, is increasing the assurance of who is wielding that MFA. So my one piece of advice for people who may just be getting started with this is the multi-factor authentication is table stakes, but it's not enough. And knowing who is performing that multi-factor authentication, having that assurance of the identity of the individual on the other side is critically important for your systems to be able to make the access decisions that are required for what those individuals are trying to connect to in a secure way. And if I could put in just one last plug, this aligns with last year's executive order and last week's most recent memorandum from OMB M2209, which talk about the zero trust framework of never trust, always verify. Those aren't mutually exclusive. The fabric of trust I mentioned is not disallowed by that zero trust model. You can be challenging for authentications and revalidating who's at the door and what key are they using to get in. Those to me are some of the basic things that I think people need to keep in mind. The multi-factor authentication is a minimum, and knowing who the person is, who owns that digital identity, and they align perfectly with the zero trust initiatives that I know many of my colleagues and peers across the government and across the private sector as well are working on right now.
And Chris, your last piece of advice?
Yeah, a couple things, Wyatt. First of all, I was reading an article a few weeks ago in Forbes, and I came across a quote that I thought was great. And it said, companies can no longer afford to indulge the legacy mindset of act now, secure it later. Security needs to be baked into everything an organization does from the beginning. Now, this sounds relatively simple and straightforward, and just about everyone will say that they do this, but I've encountered few organizations that really do it well. So I think, baking security in early and not just often, always, is very important. That said, the real purpose of this article that I was reading was about something that those of us in the identity and access management space have seen coming for quite some time, but the past 2 years really expedited this truth, and that is identity is the new perimeter. And what this means is that in our ever evolving world, the organizational perimeter or network perimeter of an organization is quickly fading away thanks to things like cloud, remote work environments, increased reliance on mobile devices, etc. Identity, strong MFA, federation, and trust are now the new perimeters for organizations. And how well you do at efficiently and effectively letting the good guys in to access the systems and data that they're authorized to access, while at the same time keeping the bad guys out, will largely determine how effectively you're able to carry out your mission.
That's a great point to end on. I wish we could chat a little more, but we're going to have to kind of leave it there. Jeff Erickson and Chris Goodwin, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights about more effective ways to manage identity and access management in today's increasingly challenging cybersecurity environment.
Thank you.
Thanks, Wyatt.